we're going to dive right into this holiday. And when you and I spoke a little bit to prepare, we were acknowledging that Shavuot isn't exactly on fire in the Jewish community, and particularly ours. I don't want to denigrate it. I don't want to start with the negative, although Jews are very good at that. But why do you think this holiday is sort of not working? It's not prioritized. I think that's a fair comment. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. I think Shavuot is one of the least loved holidays for most people. It's certainly one of the least familiar holidays for people of the big major holidays. Shavuot is biblical, and it's part of a 3-holiday cycle called the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage holidays that are really at the core of Jewish practice. And most people can name, if you stop people on the street and ask them to name the Shalosh Regalim, the ones who wouldn't look at you funny would say, well, I know that there's Pesach. Some would say, and I think the other one is Sukkot. And then they'd probably go searching for Shavuot, but they all are part of this collective unit. And Shavuot.
Before I don't want to take a huge detour, but I actually didn't grow up knowing there were 3 pilgrimage holidays. They make sense to me now that I do, but they're kind of out of order in the calendar. Am I right?
It depends when you start the calendar.
Okay.
I know you don't really want to, how big of a detour do we go on? I did grow up knowing them because my father tested me. You can imagine how fun it was to grow up in my house.
You've had a lot of therapy, a lot of Jewish therapy for that.
Just enough.
That's
enough.
Stressful.
Yeah, just enough. So yeah, they are out of order.
If you start the year Rosh Hashanah,
they are out of order.
The first pilgrimage holiday is Sukkot.
Right, and
that is not.
It's the last pilgrimage holiday, and the reason for that is, and part of this will probably be a theme that we come back to a lot tonight is, nobody sat down and organized all of this all at once, right? So these practices and these customs and this calendar developed, and not always, and so there are kind of overlapping and conflicting cycles. Rabbinic texts are very clear that there are 4 New Years in the Jewish calendar. One of them is Rosh Hashanah, but one of them is Pesach. And Pesach makes sense as a good New Year. It's the springtime, things are budding and growing. And so for the Shalosh Regalim, for the 3 pilgrimage holidays, that's really your starting point, is Pesach and the leaving of Egypt. And then when you leave Egypt and you free, you then start marching towards Mount Sinai. That's the next stop on our people's story. Mount Sinai is where Shavuot comes in. It is the holiday when we recall receiving Torah. And then
there's thunder, there's lightning.
And it's big. And then the next thing is Sukkot, where we leave Sinai and we start our wandering through the desert, 40 years of wandering, and we dwelled in these temporary
and fetching.
Well, throughout. I mean, we were fetching before Sinai.
We were fetching. That's a good title for a book.
Or a
Fetching
band.
Before Sinai.
Yeah, that was going to be my rock band.
That would be great. I could be a lead singer with my voice.
Done.
You have talent.
You're
have
right.
talent.
Talent. Sorry. So
Debbie Palmer actually texted me and said, is there going to be a Sondheim theme for today? So we have to figure out like a perfect Sondheim song for Sinai before we finish this conversation. But back to why it's not working. Why.
Part of why it's not working, I would argue that it's never been 100% working. It worked very well as an agricultural holiday. All of these holidays originally were agricultural holidays, deeply rooted in the land cycles of Israel. And
there's always barley. Barley seems to be involved.
Barley kicks it off. Barley is the Passover offering, is what's going on, is the barley is ready, and so we are harvesting it and bringing it to the temple. When you count all of the time between Pesach and Shavuot, you have the ripening of wheat. And I know everyone was so excited to talk about agricultural crops when they came tonight. They're like, I know what I need for
you guys
Shavuot.
Don't leave us. Leave us. We're getting...
The thing that
I always start to glaze over too when we talk about like bringing the wheat.
Definitely the thing that's kept Shavuot from being sexy is the wheat, But this was the wheat harvest, and so people would go and bring their wheat, and then Sukkot. The other thing they brought was their bikurim, their first crops, And that's in the Bible too. That's in the Torah too. And on Sukkot, that was like, it's the fall and it's the end of the growing season. It's everything else is gathered and harvested. And so, you have these holidays attached to the rhythms of what you would be experiencing, even if you weren't a farmer in your area, because you were around people who were farmers and you were part of that whole community. So big problem happens with the destruction of the temple, and the rabbis are trying to figure out how we do Jewish without the temple. Because all of a sudden we can't bring these offerings.
And this is 70.
70 CE.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of fast forwarding.
I know that.
Yeah, I am. I gave you rabbi points in my head, and we were gonna, we'll see where we get at the end. But Pesach and Sukkot in the Torah are tied to events and narratives in our people's story, and Shavuot is not. Shavuot is not discussed in the Torah or in the Bible as the day when we received the Torah. This is something the rabbis kind of have to invent and kind of shoehorn in order to make it alive and relevant. So even for the rabbis, Shavuot was kind of like a problem. Today, not only do we have a few problems. It's June for the most part, most of the time, and people tend to be doing other things in June than getting ready to celebrate the giving of the Torah. And the other thing that I think is hard is that, one of the most popular holidays for Jews, both amongst Jews and for people who aren't Jewish, but looking at the Jewish calendar, is Pesach, right? It's a story that everyone can connect to. It's
universal.
It's universal. We left slavery. We became free. That is the paradigm God sets out for the world, that nobody should be subjugated, that slavery isn't the final word, the tyrants don't win, right? And that's why that story has inspired not just our people, but so many other communities in their own social movements and in their own core stories and master narratives. Even Sukkot is kind of, you can get behind it. It has something attached to it. Both Pesach and Sukkot have mitzvot, commandments attached to them that are about food and gathering and bringing people into your home. And Shavuot doesn't have any of this. It is primarily practiced outside of the home in the synagogue or at an all-night study session, which, what makes study even better? Putting it late in the day. For any religious school student, they'll tell you that, as bad as 6 is, can you imagine midnight? It's rough.
When I did it at the JCC Tikkun, I arrived at 10 p.m. Like, it was kind of just getting going, and stayed literally till the sun came up. I mean, I had to sleep all day to prepare for this and drink a lot of coffee. But it isn't necessarily a barn burner. There actually were thousands of people there. I couldn't believe it. But generally, I can imagine, like, my husband was like, "You're going to do what? When?" I mean, it's not an obvious sign me up on a summer weekend. And just so people realize, I want to make sure they know the date so that they can go to
mark your calendars. We're selling
mark
it.
Your calendar. Is Saturday, June 4th is the evening, and you study into the night. Am I right? All the way, all day.
All day, or from that evening onward until the morning service. And I will say, if you've never been to the JCC, it is outstanding.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And as self-deprecating as we have been about Shavuot and Judaism, like, you will not find a better version of it. So I will say, go try it out. If you don't like it there, I don't know what to say, but it is one of the best versions I've ever seen.
And there's cheesecake, because Zabar supplies the cheesecake. Can you explain why cheesecake?
There's only cheesecake if you get there early enough, because people eat all the cheese.
Because we're Jews and they descend on the cheesecake. But let's explain why dairy is a thing.
Do you want the real answer?
Yeah, but very condensed.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows why there's cheesecake.
I thought it's that the kosher laws weren't handed down.
There's theories and people give explanations. That's right. But so yeah, right. They all of a sudden got the laws of kashrut and couldn't prepare their meal, and so they had a milk meal because they couldn't get their meat meal together. That is one really untrue explanation. Another is that the Torah is supposed to be like quoting from Song of Songs, Shir Shirim, sweet on our lips like honey and milk, or milk and honey.
Nice.
Beautiful.
That's also a folklore.
Beautiful folkloric custom explanation. The other is, the people had to go through a very rigorous process to make themselves ready to receive Torah on Mount Sinai. And so similarly, we don't do anything that might, having a meat meal involves the spilling of blood and the killing of a life. And, similarly, that you wouldn't wear leather on Yom Kippur, you would similarly not have a meat meal on Shavuot. We don't really know why, but it is a custom, it is a tradition, and so we keep doing it because the tradition is real.
And is cheesecake the thing, or is there other? Is there,
Anything dairy,
you can have a blintz. You can have a
blintzes,
blintz.
is what I think of. I hear like the sisterhood in my synagogue talking about the blintzes, but I prefer cheesecake. That's my
Me too.
dairy of choice.
too.
But yeah,
So
that's
before we take the deep dive into some of the themes that are, I think, pretty challenging and interesting, and in some ways, I think, stirring for us to think about right now. What did you do growing up? Just so we know, because you obviously grew up with one rabbi after another in your ancestry. But what was like the typical Lorge Shavuot observance, if any?
Yeah, we usually went to services because growing up in my congregation, and I think for many Reform congregations and some conservative, Erev Shavuot, the evening service, was led by our confirmation class, like completely. And it was a really like kind of a big communal thing to show up for that. And so we would go almost every year to kind of cheer on the class. And I watched as my siblings each took their place. And, we had, we don't do this at Central, but there was like a literal chain of tradition that every class would attach a link into.
Oh, cool. Like a link. Oh, that's nice.
And so, you kind of waited for your turn to get up there and, add your link to that chain.
Nice.
So that was a big part of it. I would sometimes go to the daytime service too. I did not grow up going to an all-night, Tikkun Leil Shavuot study session. It was not part of what I did. So that I kind of found later, and definitely, I think it was upon your urging when I first got to New York, went to the one in JCC and was like, wow.
So it was wow. I remember walking in and thinking, this is like going to be a loser kind of experience. And I could barely open the door. There were thousands of people. And the experience of it is also affirming this is the place to be. I should be doing this right now. I'm surrounded by people who have actually decided this is worth their time. And it's just so people understand, there's like 8 offerings each hour of like different learning things. You can go do poetry, you can do folk dancing, you can hear about Israel, you can hear about Midrash, it is kind of a cornucopia. Go ahead, I can see you.
I was just, no, for me, it was
in.
all of that is true. And there is such a buzz and there is so much you can choose to, there's so many different offerings. But coming from the Chicago Jewish community, which tends to, one of the things I found myself missing early on was, where do all of the Jews come to gather and do something together? And there weren't a lot of moments where the real whole Jewish community of New York got together. And while obviously the JCC can't fill the, can't seat the entire Jewish community of New York, it really felt like every community was represented.
That's a great point. And every denomination, it didn't matter kind of how you pray, or even if you pray.
Yeah. And people were coming from their own synagogues to like come and jump in. And I just thought that was beautiful.
I totally agree. I also just want to talk about the Midrash that says that one of the reasons we study all night is because we almost overslept at Mount Sinai, that essentially we almost missed the moment. We almost missed the law, the giving of the law. And so this ensures that we don't sleep through it. And I just thought, on one level, there's humor in that, but on another level, I think it's worth asking you whether it is a metaphor for our moment of whether we're sleeping in a way through some of what we've inherited and what it means to have received this law, even if it's not animated for us every day in practical terms.
Yeah, that's really there's so much to unpack from that. My first thought is amazing to imagine that there was a moment in Jewish history when we didn't have such generational trauma, that the anxiety that we might sleep through something didn't keep us up all night anyway. So that's amazing to think about. But one of the things that I think makes Shavuot not super appealing or can be a barrier to entry is it is it is a weighty holiday. And it's not just that, okay, so this is the holiday when we received the Torah, when God gave us the Torah, but what is that, and how does it relate to everything around it, right? On Passover we went free, and that really could be the end of the story if we were scripting a story, right? And then what happens after is everybody could have just gone on their own way, found their way through a wilderness, and found their own promised land, right? But that's not how the story ends. The story continues, and we all go to Sinai, and it's at Sinai that we figure out why we are free. We are free in order to receive this Torah, and in order to, through that Torah, get our mission, right? Which is to perfect and repair the world, right? We were given this great gift of redemption. We were allowed to taste what the world is supposed to be like. And then what a bummer, the whole world isn't like that, right? We had this taste of this great redemption that's supposed to be for the world, and and we have to wait for it to happen. And we don't just wait. We are given this blueprint through the commandments for how we can go about and try to make our community and our world around us as close to heaven as we can while we're waiting. Or maybe it's in the doing that we actually create that heavenly world all around us. But it means then that it's not just something that happens to us, it's accepting responsibility and accepting obligation and accepting that the work is actually on us.
And that idea, I just want to really push you on that, because in a way, it should be the most important holiday in that sense. It's the beginning of Judaism. It's contract. It's a contract we have signed to whether or not we're living 613. It's that we are signing on. We are saying yes. Am I wrong?
No, that's right. And even the language that we end up using talks about it like this, is that when we say all of Israel is responsible for each other, that Talmudic phrase that you hear all the time, the word that's used is that we're actually guarantors for one another. That's what that word responsibility means. Like the legal sense that actually not only are we responsible, but we've all signed on and are guarantors for one another. And if you're slacking off, I have to pull up the weight. And so, this is a yearly reminder of, hey, you know what? Your people all chose and signed on to this, and you have to keep choosing to do it too. And not only you have to, but actually, it's the whole point, right? Like, it's where the meaning is to be found. It's where the connection is to be found. It's where the purpose is to be found. It's why you are free. You are free so that you can try to make the world a little bit better. And we have ethical commandments that are actually supposed to help guide you. And then we have these ritual commandments that are supposed to be great reminders of the ethical commandments, and are supposed to help connect us to one another.
What I really am hearing you say is that it's not just that we're accepting something passively at all. It's that we're accepting a charge. We're accepting a mandate to go and do and heal, repair, make a difference. That part of this mantle in the thunder and lightning is not like you are now anointed. It's that you are now demanded. You are now, something is expected.
The call from Sinai is a calling to obligation, responsibility, and purpose. It's a task, and that can feel like that can feel onerous, or I would suggest it's also an opportunity to find direction and purpose and meaning. And so, you can look at it either way, but I think for thousands of years, it's through this idea of commandedness that we actually have found meaning and direction to our lives, an anchor, so that we don't float around aimlessly. We know exactly what it is we're supposed to be doing.
But it's not easy. As you said, this is a serious moment, and it's also a serious religion. And I'm thinking also just the time that we're in, I know we're also weary of hearing that anti-Semitism is at its height, but in the 40 years that ADL has been reporting on anti-Semitic incidents, this is the highest in history. We see obviously what it's like to be buffeted about anything pro-Israel on social media, or even anything Jewish identifying. And it strikes me that this holiday also takes on that resonance of, are we going to stand at Sinai with Jewish pride? Sounds almost like a slogan, but what does that actually mean right now? Of to say, I sign on for this very publicly, very without apology, maybe with some misgivings, maybe with some disquiet. It's not that everything is perfect, but I'm not going to shy away from the Sinai moment this year, particularly when people are in a sense pushing a lot of Jews into the closet.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an uncloseted holiday. You know, you can turn Passover into a great apologetic of universalism, right? You
Mm.
can't do that with Shavuot. Shavuot is as particular as it gets. Um, you celebrate it in Jewish spaces, and you celebrate it by doing Jewish acts, and the celebration is for receiving Jewish obligations that make you unique and different. And at the same time, we read a story about somebody who isn't Jewish. So there is sort of a push and pull to this holiday too.
Yeah,
There's
that's
this,
Ruth. That's Ruth. You're already previewing Ruth. I'm not ready for Ruth,
we don't have to go
but
there yet, but I just at least want to telegraph there is this
yeah, we're
subversive
going to
tension.
Ruth, everybody. Don't worry.
Um,
Um,
but there's, you know, it is an unapologetically Jewish festival, which is a weird thing to say because they all are unapologetically Jewish, but there's no hiding this one.
mm,
And it is this opportunity to reaffirm, right? Which is why confirmation has historically been on this day. Um, it, you know, this isn't something you choose once. It's something you have to actively keep choosing, um, and you know, there's a resonance to that, both in terms of how we see ourselves in the world and our relationship to one another, but also to just our own practice and ritual.
mm. There is a often cited image in the Talmud that's described by Rav Avdimi. You may be familiar with him. I'm not. He's not like my buddy, but he's in Shabbat 88a, if for anyone who's looking. And he describes God holding Mount Sinai over the heads of the children of Israel, essentially that we were coerced. This is not like this beautiful choice we just described, or this moment of agency and Jewish decision making. It's like, you got to be an idiot not to say yes, I
God made
accept
us.
the Ten
God made us
Commandments.
an
So
offer we couldn't refuse, basically, is what was going on.
exactly. So what's that? Is there any contemporary resonance there? Do you feel like some of us, or maybe I could speak for myself, maybe guilt is another coercion? It's just a sense like, if I don't do this, bad things are going to happen to me. I'm breaking the chain, whatever it is. Like, is there a sense of coercion at all? If you're comfortable going there, do you
I
think?
mean, I would, you know, I guess I'm sure that for some that is the case. It's not that's not what motivates me, and it's not how I'd want other people to be motivated. You know, a contrasting
Like fear.
image for this holiday is that this is the chuppah, right? That this is the wedding between God and the Jewish people, and the Torah becomes our ketubah. And I would so much rather lift up that image of us engaging in what is a marriage ceremony through this document, and that these are the mutual obligations we have towards one another, us to God and God to us. And you know, there's some baggage around God and talking about God in this way, but to see at least an expression of Torah as love, right? And that it both asks us to be to remind us that our motivating one of the major motivating emotions in this religion is love, the love that we should feel towards one another, that should animate the commandments that we do towards one another. And that, you know, whether you want to think of God as you know, and however you want to think of God, but that this text was given to us with a sense of love. And in the same way, one of my favorite texts talks about, you know, parents love their kids so much, they give them rules, limits, and a sense of, you know, how they might expect them to walk in the world. That when you love something, you actually want to give it direction, and that is what the Torah is for us. It was God's
Beautiful.
expression of love to us.
Right. It's like you love your kids, so you give them a curfew and you don't let them stay out all night.
And you try to
I
give
know
them
that's
like values or a
in
purpose.
values.
Yeah.
Let's go to Ruth. Before we come back to some of what this means for us, just to understand why we read Ruth for this holiday. What is the connection at all? And I know it's sort of a hard story to summarize, but you don't have to do it that quickly, but we have some good questions. So the
Ruth.
condensed Ruth. Go.
Okay. So
you could sing it, Ari, if you want to. I don't know if there's a Ruth song.
There is, because we sing it with our confirmands, but I will not do that. So
you might really lose people.
I think people are going to just start logging off. All right.
Falling off.
Every pilgrimage holiday, all of the Shalosh Regalim have a scroll that's read on them. On Passover, on Pesach, we read Song of Songs. On Sukkot, we read Kohelet or Ecclesiastes. And on Shavuot, we read Ruth. Ruth is the story of a family who is from Bethlehem, Beit Lechem, in the land of Israel. There is a famine, and they go to Moab, which is the kingdom that is the historic enemy of the Jewish people. One of them, right? We have enough, but one of them, one of the worst of the worst, Moab. There, a bunch of the sons fall in love with Moabite women. The sons die, the husband dies, and all that are left are these two Moabite women who had married into this Israelite family, and their mother-in-law, who survived the death of her husband and all of her kids. She basically says to them, I have to go back to my land.
This is Naomi. Did you say
this is Naomi? I didn't say her name. Yeah. This is Naomi. She basically says, I'm going to go back to my community, and you should go and live lives. You're young and you can rebound from this, essentially. And one of them does, but one of them, Ruth, says basically, you are my family, and I'm going to go with you. Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will be my people. Wherever you are buried is where I will be buried, and your God will be my God. And having made this, it's an incredible declaration. She goes with Naomi back to Israel. And there they tried to set themselves up. These are two of the more compromised and tenuous positions you can be in ancient Near Eastern society, widows without any protection. They are poor, they have no way to earn a living. So what do? It's the harvest time, and they go and glean. And now I'm really going to get you to sit up in your seats. Gleaning, we get to talk about gleaning too tonight. Oh my goodness. Woo! Gleaning. All right, I know this is bad, but it's just like one of the most incredible things. The Torah says that when you are harvesting your crop, you aren't supposed to you're not supposed to be really thorough. You have to, if you drop something, you're greedy, right? If you drop something, let it fall. If you miss something, you miss it, and you can't get all of the corners of your field. And the idea is that there is enough left over for the poor and the hungry and the marginalized to be able to feed themselves. And so that's what Ruth goes to do. She goes to glean so that she can provide for herself and Naomi. She ends up meeting Boaz, who's kind of a cousin of Naomi's. Boaz and her kind of, Boaz, Boaz
we can
looks,
skip Boaz.
But Boaz does look out for her and make sure that she has enough to glean. And then they end up, there's a threshing floor scene, which we won't talk about, but eventually they fall in love and they get married. That's a very quick.
I didn't mean, sorry, my daughter just called me on Zoom, so I went out for a minute.
No worries.
But that was perfect.
She heard we were talking about gleaning and she wanted to join. We get all of the college kids.
Right, you don't want to miss the gleaning. But I also want to bring the barley back for a minute, because I read in my right that it also, Ruth's story takes place during the season of the barley harvest. So
yeah,
we've got.
But isn't that a bummer, because Shavuot's all about the wheat harvest?
Right, it always comes back to the wheat. The fetching and the wheat, which is the other name for our band.
Right.
David, can you just mention David? Because that's
So Ruth and Boaz end up having a son who is a part of the lineage of King David, which is important because King David ends up being the forerunner of the Messiah. So you have both Israel's greatest king and the kingly figure from the Davidic line that's going to set the world right. And who do those figures come from? They come from a Moabite woman, a woman who comes from our enemy, who on paper shouldn't be allowed,
A
a non-Jew,
non-Israelite.
right,
Amazing.
shouldn't be allowed into the congregation of Israel, but is. And so that is one of the subversive elements of Ruth is, as opposed to Ezra and Nehemiah, which are biblical books that are just condemning, Jews who don't marry Jews, and foreign women.
Why do you say subversive? Why subversive?
Well, because they tend to be lifted up in the tradition more. Here is this book of Ruth that contrary to that point, right, is sort of the undercurrent of other aspects of the Bible, that actually here is a non-Israelite woman, a foreigner, a non-Jew, who marries in and ends up becoming the mother of the Messiah and the greatest king. But she's more than that. She's this symbol of unbounded kindness, right? She is not bound by the Torah that we are celebrating, that we are receiving. She's not bound by the covenant that we enter at Sinai, and yet she is the kindest character in this story. She is generous of spirit. She is loving and charitable, and stands in counterpoint to all of the Israelites. Naomi is a lovely character, but is not, the person you emulate from this story. And Boaz is a great character too, but also not the person we emulate from this story. So
is it also not, Ari, that her commitment to Judaism, her decision to take that on, which is now a small thing, is supposed to be akin to what we did or do at Sinai?
So all of us are asked to basically put ourselves in her shoes. This foreign non-Israelite woman who is kinder than the Israelites in the story. I mean, that's deeply subversive when you think about it.
Wow, yeah. It's almost like heresy.
Well, and there's some other elements too, right? This family, Naomi's family, flees from Bethlehem in Israel because of a famine. They're hungry. But that shouldn't matter. If the gleaning, I don't know, I'm bringing back gleaning again, but if the gleaning is working, it shouldn't matter if they're hungry. They should be able to still have, like, that society, if we've really accepted Torah and if we're living, right, we're finally in the land, we made it to the promised land. How are we doing? Not so well, because Israelites have to leave because we're not feeding them. We're not actually living up to the ethical ideal of this Torah and this covenant that we've received. So much so that we have to go to the Moabites to find the land that we should be living in. So in some ways, this is like a gut check on how are we doing when we actually have the power and we are able to set up the good society we're supposed to set up, and we're not doing so well. We need Ruth to come in and show us the way it's supposed to be.
So I want to go to some of these questions before I get back to my own. Someone is asking, I think someone named Arden. Hi, Arden. Why don't we blow shofar on Shavuot?
Because the question is why don't we? Since shofar is one of the sounds that's heard at Sinai. I'm not 100% sure. I've never heard of a tradition that suggests it should. In the Torah, Rosh Hashanah is just clearly called Yom Teruah, the day of the shofar blowing, and so I don't know, but it's a nice innovation. Part of it could be around musical instruments. We heard it. It's one of the sounds that they heard at Sinai, so that's why the connection might be.
Right. But Arden, you've stumped Ari, and that's that is worth.
It's a new question. It's a new question to me. We're not supposed to blow shofar on Shabbat, so it could be because of the Chag aspect that we don't do it during a holiday.
Ed is asking, is Central Shavuot service for the confirmants, I can't pronounce anything right now, and their families, or for the entire community? Should or can we all come? Yes, right?
Yes, yeah. Erev Shavuot is open to everyone. You can come.
Oh, it's great.
It's a great confirmation group. They're writing divrei Torah, and they're going to chant Torah and
personal statements. There's no cheesecake, but other than that,
we still cannot serve food. But there'll be spiritual cheesecake.
That's a shanda, but we'll talk about that. A shanda of a Sinai shanda. But It is an extremely powerful night, so I can't recommend it more highly. Do you want to give the date and time, Diana? Thank you.
All of our
for that
services start at 6 always. So if you're if it's an evening service, so if you're wondering what time does that service at Central start, it starts at 6, and it is on the 4th. So you can come, and then is that the night of the Tikkun at the JCC
Yeah.
too? So you come to
think,
our
well,
services,
you can do that later, right?
and then start making your way over to the west side. It's a great doubleheader.
You guys hear me, right?
We can hear you.
Okay, let's hear Nancy's question. Where is Tikkun Olam in this holiday? Thank you, Nancy.
So, Tikkun Olam is in the mitzvot that we have been given, the commandments that we've been given, right? That is the blueprint, right? That is the so what, right? You were freed, and so what? You were freed for this. You were freed to go be a part of the repairing of the world. It's helpful to remember Jewish cosmic time that has 3 major moments. The creation of the world, when we were told that we are actually made in God's image, and all humanity is too, and so that actually should change the way we relate to one another. Then at the very end of Jewish time, you have redemption, the Messianic age when the Messiah will come. Oh, so there's Tikkun Olam too, because King David and Ruth. And so we're reminding ourselves that that's the end goal. In between, every single moment is an opportunity for revelation. So while we stood at Sinai once, we actually are always standing at Sinai if we open our hearts and think of every single moment as an opportunity to not only learn, but also to bring God into the world. And how do we do that? We do that through our actions. Every single time you make an action, every single time you make a choice, you can choose to manifest God or to not. It's not always that simple, but that's the kind of idea. That's what it means to think of every single moment in between to be a moment of revelation. And if you start really paying attention, you'll notice that in every Jewish worship service, in every Jewish event, in every Jewish book, you'll probably find those 3 nodes of creation, redemption, and revelation in between.
So for Reformed Jews who don't accept mitzvot as a way of life in the same way, how does this holiday work?
I think it works in the same way that I would say that probably works for Orthodox Jews too. It's just a slightly different sensibility. One of the things I think is really helpful to think about is that we call the commandments and not laws or legislation. Laws and legislation are impersonal things that exist on the books and are addressed to anyone. Commandments are things that are addressed to you. It is God saying to you, thou shalt, you Abby, or you Ari. And the difficulty is trying to take these laws that might feel impersonal and to find or discover a sense of personal calling in them. And some of them are easier than others. And some of them, as Reformed Jews, we challenge and bristle and reframe and rethink because we have to find our way to feel called to them. But that's lifetime homework, is one of my rabbinical professors would say. And the only way to discover a calling is in the doing. And so we have to keep trying them, or at least to try them and to see how they fit. And if it doesn't fit, try another. But that's the discovery. And so every year can be an opportunity to renew that sense of having to feel that calling and trying to listen and discern for the mitzvot that speak to you.
And you just said the doing. So that brings me to Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. And I know many of us have heard you talk about this, but it's so important, I think, as you explain, why, again, does the chronology feel backward there? Why are we first doing before we're listening?
So we will do and we will listen, or we will do and we will understand. You kind of get that translated in different ways.
What's said.
I wanted to just, that's what the Israelites say in response to this revelation is we will do and then we will understand, or we will hear it. And
by the way, are they responding to Moses or are they responding to God? They don't hear God, right?
Well, the tradition suggests that the voice of God was heard by every single person in a different way. And so, nice. but there is also a section in the Torah where it talks about how the Israelites heard God and were kind of afraid of it. And so they asked then Moses to be the mouthpiece because it was a little bit too much to hear God like that. Now, I think part of it is the sense of with deeds, right, which is where our religion, is lived out. Um, uh, sometimes you discover the meaning and the purpose in the doing, and there's no way to intellectualize it or to wrap your heart and mind around it until you are doing it.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean that once you start doing it, you have to do it forever, or that you will find your way into it. But this is Franz Rosenzweig, who is a big German Jewish intellectual pre-war. He used to say, when somebody asked him if he did a certain commandment, if he didn't, he would say, "Not yet." Right? And it's the sense of I haven't yet discovered my way into that one yet, but I'm still obligated to try or to do. So when I'm working with our confirmation students, because I get to have the most time with them, I ask them to think about why it is they do the things they do, the Jewish things that they do, right? And if their answer is, well, that's what my parents have told me to do, or that's just what I've seen people do, I ask them to try it differently, because if you can't make it your own, if it's just something that's passed down to you and it's passive, it's not really your heritage. You have to enliven it for yourself. And saying, I do this because it's the way it's always been, is not enough. And it's never been enough. It has to have resonance and a connection to your soul. Otherwise, it's empty.
You know, I interviewed Judith Shulevitz, the journalist and the author, about her book, The Sabbath. And I was saying that I felt like I was constantly failing Shabbat. Like I wanted to go completely off devices, and I wanted to just be with my family and not carry and not do commerce and all these things. And that there were it was just a chipping away, and how hard it was to actually clear the space, clear the decks. And she mentioned the Rosenzweig quote of the "not yet." She said, "Don't say that you've failed it already. It's a not yet." So I love that. I just, again, maybe pushing us on the doing before listening. Do you see that in small things we could do? If you were going to kind of say that there's one takeaway each of us could have for this holiday of maybe something we might do, and maybe we do it on the 4th, or maybe we just do it, before the next holiday. Is there something that could be a doing without necessarily having to feel it first, or commit, as you say, forever?
Well, I mean, I think I don't want to prescribe one action, because I think it's just not how I am wired. But I would say, if there is something you have always wondered about or been curious about, well, why is it that it's this, or why is it, or I've seen people do that, why does that happen? These aren't. It's okay to not know, and it's totally okay to wonder, but turn that curiosity and that wonder into some study. Find an answer, and then if you've been curious about it, try it. See what it's like and see how it feels for you. And I have yet to meet a Jewish professional, cantor, rabbi, or educator who is not super excited and motivated when somebody says to them, I've always wondered, yada, yada, yada. What's that all about? And would you be willing to tell me a little bit more about it? This whole Jewish enterprise only works in partnership, right? And the whole idea of God giving us commandments is we have to make the world into the image that God has given us. God can't do it for us. Back to the wheat, right? Wheat is not something that you can actually eat as it comes out of the ground. It requires human ingenuity to make it into bread. That's what's different than barley. And that's, again, like Torah, it requires this partnership between God and humanity. And we have to be the agents. And so I tend to be, if I was going to say lean into something, I would say lean into ethical mitzvot. I think the world needs it badly right now. And I also think it's an antidote to anti-Semitism. When we are openly and actively acting as Jews in the world in ways that bless not just our community, but the communities around us, I don't think there's a better antidote to anti-Semitism.
That in a way, the particularist holiday can lead us to others. That's in a way that the Jewish mandate is not just an internal one.
Yeah, it's sometimes I get so interested by people who say, well, I know it's the right thing to do, but I don't think that's like what, it's not because of Judaism.
That's a Jewish,
right. But it is, you know, and it doesn't mean that it's exclusively Jewish, but it is absolutely, I hope that as Jews, our good acts are motivated by our Judaism, and there is a way into it that way, and it's important, I think, for Jews to activate that sensibility.
Meredith is asking, what is the relationship between Shavuot and Pentecost? Is Pentecost just an appropriation? Whoa, that's a big question.
I
Thank
mean,
you, Meredith.
the question between,
I'm so glad that Ari has to answer that and not me.
These ideas are related, right? And right, the whole idea that you're counting from Pesach to Shavuot 49 to get to your 50th is totally right. That is where Pentecost comes from. The question of appropriation, I mean, look, a lot of Christianity is built upon our Bible, right? And the ideas are appropriated. I think that's a fair thing to say, and I think with intention, right? That was what the community was setting out to do. That's what the writers of the Christian Bible were setting out to do.
Okay. The fact that this is a moment of thunder and lightning, like we've seen the movie, we know that this is an apex crescendo moment, but we have that wonderful still small voice idea that appears in Kings, that we heard, we should pay attention to the still small voice, and that essentially that's really what it means to sign on to this idea, this contract, this covenant. It's something that is very kind of quiet and personal. That at least resonates for me.
Yeah.
So can you respond to that?
No,
maybe you're a defender of the thunder, and you should feel entitled to do that.
The thunder and the awe is greatly motivating. I think it's why we have holidays, right? Holidays are like the kind of the all of the drama that we need to kind of kickstart us into thinking of these things. But we live our life in the quiet, small moments of the day to day, and if we're missing those moments, we are bifurcating our identities, right? Like Judaism is meant to be lived in the arena of our lives, not in the arena of the synagogue. And if we have relegated it to the synagogue, we're missing all of those moments. Almost every great Jewish thinker and writer talks about how we realize the commandments and how we make God manifest and real through our choices and decisions. And that has to be lived in the day to day. That's how we treat our spouse. That's how we treat our family. That's how we treat the random person on the street who's walking by us and the person who cuts us off while we're driving. It's all, Judaism has something to say about how you live through that moment. And
that actually, I love that, Ari, and it also echoes a question that came in while you were speaking. We find ways to bring the lessons of Pesach into our lives throughout the year. And the same is true of Sukkot. How can we live the lessons of Shavuot throughout the year? I mean, you've just kind of given us the language.
The lesson of Shavuot is that you are responsible, right? You went free. You've been given your freedom. God, both to be free from slavery, but also to have free will, right? That's the other freedom we're given by God. To be able to choose responsibility. That's what entering into this covenant and accepting Torah is all about. And that is not the most popular idea in the modern world today. You have obligations to your community, you have obligations to strangers, and you have obligations to one another. You're responsible for yourself and your actions, but you're responsible for acting in a way that actually betters those around you. And it's, I called it once in a sermon, a mutual enslavement. Right? We left the slavery of Egypt to mutually enslave ourselves to one another and to one another's betterment. And it can't just be your community or your loved ones. It's the stranger, right? That's the motivating aspect that, right? Even on Shavuot, when we are bringing our bikurim, when we're bringing our first fruits, or when we are learning about gleaning, it all comes back to because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It motivates the commandments. And that's how these two holidays are tied together. All of the particularism and all of the demands that are made on us are because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and we know what that feels like.
So the idea that we all stood there which I have heard from you, my rabbi, and every other rabbi, this idea that we all receive Torah. I mean, it sort of does defy any rational logic, because we know we weren't literally there. And I'm not just being a stubborn rationalist. I want to understand what that idea means, because it feels so urgent. I remember Rabbi Peter Rubenstein sometimes saying that to him, it meant that we each have to think about what we were put here for. Essentially, something is required of each of us, and this holiday reminds us we have to figure out what that is. And I just wonder what it is. Would it help us understand that idea that we were all there?
I mean, I love that from Rabbi Rubenstein. I hadn't heard him teach that. So thank you for that. That's something I'll carry forward. But I think there's different reasons why that's a really important statement. One, on a holiday when we celebrate Ruth, we also recognize that people come into Judaism in different ways. Not everyone's born into it. But regardless of how you come into Judaism, the moment you choose Judaism, our tradition has already affirmed, you know what, you were at Sinai and you received these commandments, you personally. And that is a certain statement about what it means to choose Judaism and what your place is within it, no matter how you've come to it. So I think that's one really important statement from that story. The other is, you can think of that as we all were somehow embodied in that one moment all the way back in time. But the other is to see it as an invitation to continually think of revelation or the giving of this Torah as unfolding all the time in front of you. And you have to constantly choose it. You have to constantly decide to walk there. And that's part of the activity of going about life, is to seeing every moment as an opportunity to affirm not just your Judaism, but your responsibility to the tradition and to your people, and therefore to the world. But to view it supernaturally like that is also to say that in some ways, you have faith in the future, that there will continue to be souls who come into the world who will have been at Sinai, and that there is something that connects us. There is something that binds us to one another.
Lord, what a privilege this has been. I don't say that lightly, really. I hope this is required watching, I think, for anyone who is signing on again, not just to Torah, but to the Jewish way, to the Jewish path. Thank you for your wisdom, especially on one foot with such short notice. It just reminds us all what an extraordinary scholar and teacher and presence and pastor we have in you. Thank you to Senior Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, who blessed the fact that we do this, because it means a lot, I think, certainly to me. I don't want to be so solipsistic or particularistic, but hopefully to others, but especially to those who have been part of this. I really none of us take your prioritization for granted. It's extraordinary. It's been an amazing ride. And I have to end with Sarah Berman, who has done the heavy lifting for all of us, who has pushed me and really made this possible and conceived it all in the first place. Thank you, Rabbi Sarah Berman, for your thought and your elbow grease. And everyone, I'm not going, I admit it, to JCC this year, but I am definitely going to be studying in some form. So let's figure out something to do. Let's sign on together. Sarah, do you want to take us home?
And just adding my thanks to Rabbi Lorge, to Rabbi Buchdahl for being here, for Marcia Caban for all of her support in this whole series. Abby, to you for your wisdom, for your guidance, for your vision. But I would like to finish with the biggest thank you, which is to all of you who have been watching, who have been learning, who have been putting in the sweat, the hard labor of learning about all of these holidays and taking this learning into your lives. I can't wait to celebrate each one of these holidays with you in the coming year and in all the years to come. Thank you so much for being here. Good night, everybody.